Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Deepwatch Overwatch podcast. Today, I've got a new cast of characters for us to kind of walk through. I'll let everyone kind of quickly introduce themselves as we move through things, but I'll start with John Haas.
Yep, John Haas, Director of Adversary Response here at Deepwatch.
We'll go with Justin Hazard.
Justin Hazard, Technical Services Director.
And Carolyn Terranova.
Carolyn, Senior Director of Threat Operations.
So today, what we kind of wanted to talk about and to dig in a bit more, because we've seen it all over the news. It's going to continue to hit the news for a while. It's just, again, we think it's something we need to discuss and provide a little guidance on. It's probably the best way of putting it. Is a series of VPN Concentrator attacks that have been going on for, what do we say, like last 3 months, 4 months at this point?
For a while, yeah.
Right? It's been a continual process. Starting with, for example, like the Avanti Pulse Secure, which goes back to the Juniper days. Then moving over to, we had the, just went straight out of my head. We had the Global Protect issue with Palo Alto, and with the CVEs associated to them. And now most recently, Cisco getting their turn at the plate a couple of weeks ago. We brought in some of our experts around detection, around response, and around kind of overarching architecture and concepts. And so thought we'd talk about it for a little bit. So thinking on those specific three pieces, like John, how have you seen any commonalities in how people are being hit by these, or even what our customers are detecting or seeing within those environments?
Yeah, so we've worked quite a few of these with our customers, specifically around the Palo vulnerability. We saw a bunch of threat actors being able to do the exploit, but the follow-on activity seemed a little hard. I think that just speaks to being able to exploit something in the PAN OS and then being able to move past that. Fairly rough to do. But I guess the commonality that we do see is they're attacking the perimeter. Right. And it's just such a juicy target. Everyone has to have it with our workforce spread throughout geographically. It's just going to be a juicy target for a long time.
Yet another thing we can blame COVID for.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, obviously the edge, like we said, it's moving around a little bit. I don't know if we've seen these things from like a SD-WAN type scenario or more of those pieces. It seems a little secondary. But in talking about SD-WAN or in talking about, other things that are out there detection-wise or even connectivity-wise, hey, Justin, we've had Zero Trust Networks, and we run Zero Trust Networks here at Deepwatch for, 6, 7 years this technology's been around now?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, there's a number of reasons why. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them just kind of baffles people, right? So you have to have some way to get in the back door, unironically stating that. If you take a look, and Neil, you gave a great example of Facebook, when Facebook went down and they had no way of accessing their stuff. So in disaster recovery situations, but at the same time, in larger organizations, which we see this happening a lot with larger organizations, those processes to move things from IT that may be B2B, as an example, they are long road projects. So taking the time to actually do that thoughtfully and in a good way, like you run into this tech debt situation that just continuously repeats its cycle. And it's difficult to do that, because if you have one of your largest partners in B2B that isn't able to move off of that, you still have to support it. It's necessary for business operations. So I think that's when you look at it from a larger security, holistically, security perspective at that point in time. But I think those are going to be your main reasons. And you always obviously have the third. Sometimes it's just money. Sometimes it's cheaper. And if it comes down to money, like that's obviously a risk reward situation as well.
I mean, I think just to kind of throw this out there for larger discussion. I mean, we always, on our side, we talk about, our phrase is be threat ready and understand scenarios. But I think you're bringing up a good point on, it's not necessarily always about age. But, I came from the background of pushing NGIPSs and NGFWs and the conglomeration or the combination of different network style detection and connection technologies. We've seen that advance more and more. I really do, in my experience, I've seen people look at an existing stack and say, okay, I'm replacing the firewall with a next-gen firewall. I'm more secure. But they forget that they're doing pass-through for a VPN concentrator directly behind that.
Yeah.
Or that they've got, like you're talking about, business partner networks to where they're dropping off. In the old days, which these things we know are still active and out there, you've dropped off a Palo Alto box and just simply said, plug it in, right? That's your remote office. That's your, we see those a lot in healthcare with clinics and other pieces, right? Or even we see firewalls inside of firewalls that have embedded or deeper VPNs for outside access for other specialists to get into environments. And the other thing that I want to make sure that we kind of bring up on the reason why we do think this is as important as it is what we do know. And Carolyn, I'll throw this one over to you after I say it, is adversaries aren't necessarily targeting front doors, right? They're looking for tangential ways to get in. And we see that with HVAC, aka Target. We see that with all the other pieces that are out there. If you have a business partner network connection that you established with them 10 years ago using existing technology that hasn't broken, so you haven't fixed it, is there any way to detect those things or any way to kind of see what's going on beyond trying to do a full system on it?
So a couple things around detection. One, I would say you need to make sure that your policies are up to date. You need to make sure that you have the ability to detect flood attacks. And then you also have to be able to rely on detection in depth. So post-exploitation, you should ensure that you have the correct alerting in place to detect if a vulnerability or an exploit is on one of your devices, that whether or not a patch is available, you are assuming breach and you have the right alerting in place along the kill chain to be able to ensure that that attacker is not going to be able to move through undetected. I would also add that, for a lot of these, you see attackers using such a wide and varied range of ways to exploit that you should be relying not just on post-exploitation alerting, but on the ability to threat hunt to be able to detect that nuance. Because when you do have lots of different ways that attackers are attempting to exploit these things, you're not going to be able to thread that with a single alert. In many cases, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure by assuming that that's going to be a successful way to detect. You really need to have different types of detection outside of alerting, which would include threat hunting as well.
Yeah, and I think the Palo vulnerability showed us that. The log that you needed to actually see the back door wasn't published by Palo. They just don't give you that log. So we had a lot of customers say, hey, did I get affected by this? Well, you got scanned by it. I can tell you that for sure. And I can see some other activities, but I can't tell you for sure if something got installed because we just don't see the Nginx log. They just don't publish it. So having that detection and depth strategy and having that ability to threat hunt and especially the post-exploitation was really where we were concentrating a lot of our efforts to just make sure that, we're not seeing anything, pivot through your environment, things like that. So just, that the defense in depth is huge when it comes to this. And I think it's going to continue to be a...
The other thing I would add is security teams are going to have to be vigilant as our understanding of some of these exploits grow. Additional exploits may spawn off, and you're going to have to make sure that you're staying on top of these things when you do have affected devices to ensure that you are taking the correct mitigations as soon as they are available to you, but also that you have an awareness of how these things are developing in the wild.
I mean, to that point, right? I think it's fair to say there's blood in the water on these particular style of attacks. Right?
Sure.
I mean, even we were talking earlier on about like ConnectWise and some of the other like virtual connections or virtual desktop scenarios that are out there as well. The remote connection style attacks are still some of the low hanging fruit that are coming through this, and frankly, it also, to the detection standpoint, into good hygiene. I mean, I'd say it also comes down to not just the threat hunting, but also just enforce MFA. I mean, it's
Sure.
it's a simple.
Yeah,
It's a simple thing to say, but it is a, hey, you congratulations, you're in. Now, just verify that it's you. And if there's a question, verify that it's you again.
Yep.
Or just that. And I think the other thing that I wanted to get across, and Hazard, I'll toss it to you after this, is I mentioned earlier on, I think, again, we all agree that these things are everywhere, right? And they're usually old. Right, or they're with older connections, or they're with older pieces of infrastructure or architecture that have been put out there, and some of them may have been updated. But it's we almost have to ask ourselves, do we know where everything is? And I don't think we can answer that question as an industry right now. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. And it's kind of interesting because when Carolyn was speaking through like all the detection strategies, the first thing that popped in my head is VM, right? Like, it's honestly one of your first detection strategies of, is it in my environment? Do I know that thing's in my environment? Am I scanning? If you're scanning everything that you should be scanning that is in your environment, you would know. Then we've seen a couple of times where customers are like, do we have this in our environment? No idea. Large, small, doesn't really matter. If you know, all right, I have this asset and this is the version that it is, yes, it's affected. Now we can start making decisions. The detection component of it, absolutely, you have to have the defense in depth and post-exploitation, but we can also we have serious conversations with leadership and say, what would happen if we turn this off? What is the business impact? What is the revenue impact? If it's nominal, just turn it off, right? Like, it's not that big of a deal, but if it's going to cost you $250 million an hour, now we're having a much different conversation. So I think, I don't want to put it in the generic term of CMDB, but a CMDB with software inventory, that's why it's like one of the low-hanging fruits of security. It's like the first thing that you're supposed to do. So having those types of things and knowing those types of data points about your environment, it's an easy detection capability pretty quickly.
I mean, and the thing that I'll add to that, again, probably getting out of my lane a little bit, is I do think this is a slightly different problem than what we're seeing with like remote desktop, like to go back to ConnectWise, right? This is not somebody installed this piece of software on a random machine that would require additional hunting or additional visibility. This is, in these scenarios, generally a physical piece of hardware that is installed and powered on. And in a lot of cases, especially on disaster recovery or at DR, when we talk about break fix, you don't know if it's up and running or when's the last time that it was used, or you completely forgot about its existence. So you're not going to be able to answer that question that you just posed of, if I turn this off, what's the business impact? You almost have to just turn it off and see who comes screaming. It is a little bit of that scenario.
It's still scary in 2024 that appliances are one of the larger weaknesses in an environment because it's so locked down. You don't have the administrative functionality to get the logs, to get the information that you need in order to make a good business decision.
Or even in our metrics, in our scenarios, right? We look at, if we want to do logging for firewalls down to this connection logging piece that we generally do pull, but maybe not as much as we would want to from a critical alert perspective. Like, I don't need to know a trusted user got access to your environment 15 times a second. Like, I need it, but do I really want it? And if we're making really hard decisions from an ingestion standpoint, that may be cut. So sometimes we're cutting those numbers just to make other things go faster or to be more secure in other areas. And these boxes don't filter themselves. Right.
Yeah.
So you turn it on debug and you don't just get that list, you get all the things, right? So that's, I think, is there anything else that we could do about this? Like we talked a little bit about jokingly about zero trust, but what else could we do?
I think it's unfortunately just a multifaceted answer. You have to know what access someone has once they get into the VPN. So maybe I'm an administrator that I just need to get in and okay some payroll. So I don't need to have access into the entire network. But we see that commonly where it's just a valid account. So not even just an issue with the appliance, but the IAM roles that go along with that. Also, mergers and acquisitions. We see that a lot. All the tech debt. Justin touched on it. You get tech debt that just inherent in a regular business. You start acquiring and merging with other things. You have a lot of tech debt, and we see that quite a bit. So, unfortunately, it's just CMDB and audits and making sure that you know what you have, what's plugged in.
I mean, is it fair to say also looking at that and saying I'm talking too much in this one, but it's also a question of what you should have, but it's not showing up.
Yes.
Like sometimes the zero or the lack of that thing, especially in like M&A, like, okay, I'm not seeing anything on this list around disaster recovery.
Right.
Oh, well, yeah, that's been out of sight, out of mind for 8 years. Why? I'm glad you asked that question. Like that's another thing, just completeness of the analysis, not just looking for the, here, but also looking for things that you expect that aren't showing up.
Yeah, there's been multiple incidents responding to these types of attack where we said, well, what about this firewall? Well, we don't have a firewall there. I'm looking at it. So, being able to help customers work through that is, always, obviously it's a bad day, but they walk away a little more astute of how to find these things. So,
Justin, anything?
I think there's been this notion that some of us get kicked around of like, kind of like DEFCON levels in security, right? Yeah, those particular logs, yes, we can't pull those like the Nginx ones, but if you could, to your point earlier, Neil, like I don't need to know that Carolyn logged in 17 times just to do the thing that she needed to do. So we're going to track that log, but maybe there is a notion of when we need to turn things, ratchet things back up very quickly, like we have that as kind of our IR plan, right? Of this needs to be turned on in order to get the visibility that we need, and these alerts need to be turned on. That's a part of our IR, and we kick that off as soon as we go. Now, to be fair, that takes a level of thoughtfulness and detail and planning that I think does not come around often in security. So it's an interesting kind of paradigm on which way do you go. And I think one of the DR components of it as well that's always really interesting to me is, why is DR always like the last thing that people look at? But as soon as, like, why hasn't that plan been hit every 6 months or every year? Like, how do you not know whether or not that's working?
I mean, the stories, right? I mean,
we've all been there.
Yeah, hey, I got a generator. Test the generator runs every 6 months. It's got a certificate. Some dude wrote on it. Look, it works. What do you mean it's not plugged into the data center? It's generating power, but nothing's actually coming through. And I will make a unofficial plug for that is kind of the concept of OSDA is we have logs and locations that we can go get when we need them. When we do have peak plans or other pieces that we want to talk about. Carolyn, anything we've forgotten?
I just wanted to circle back to asset inventory. Having an asset inventory isn't just important to know what your list of devices are out there, though, but this information should be enriching your detections. I know that we say, oh, well, we'll just, we'll have all these detections. We'll respond to all of them. That's not a feasible solution. And you should have levels of enrichment, especially when it comes to criticality. to be able to know when you have a serious priority on your hands, and don't become, basically numb to all the noise after a certain amount of time.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave you all be. And really appreciate your time. Hopefully that this discussion around where VPN concentrators may be, the situations that we're seeing around them, some of our suggestions on from a human threat hunt perspective, from it's MFA people, and also just that, like Carolyn was saying, like asset inventory, like what's going on and the value of that has been useful to you, and then that you can take this and apply this to your to dealing with these problems, as we're sure they're going to continue to persist. And on that note, I will leave you with one final question. How old is your latest security diagram for your network devices? Have a good night. Enjoy your time. Thanks for paying attention. Appreciate it.